So today I am doing a comparison that nobody is asking for. I am comparing a 2019 MacBook Pro with a 6-core Intel i7 processor, 32 gigs of RAM, and an AMD 5300. And it's going up against a brand new MacBook Air M4 with 32 gigs of RAM and a 10-core CPU and a 10-core GPU. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm even making this comparison. Well, here's the thing. I've been using this Intel MacBook Pro for 3 or 4 years now. At my previous job, they just gave it to me when I changed jobs because it was so old that they were replacing them all anyway and they said I could have it. At my new job, it's a really small company. They didn't buy us new computers, and so I have just kept using it. And honestly, I haven't had too many complaints. It's done everything I need and more. Sure, with each new release of Mac OS, it feels more sluggish, and I feel like I'm missing out every time I go to download some software and it gives you the Intel Mac or Apple Silicon version of the software. But work-wise, it's literally done everything I need, and I game on it occasionally, and it's been okay. We ordered this MacBook Air for our kids in their homeschool, and our plan was that down the road when the new MacBook Pros come out, probably with the M5, we would look at upgrading my Intel Mac since this version of Mac OS is the last one that's going to support Intel Macs. So we bought the MacBook Air, and as it was shipping, I was doing a little bit of research about the MacBook Airs, and I came across a few things that showed that with just a little modification, you can get MacBook Pro performance out of a MacBook Air. Now I know that right now I'm not comparing an M4 MacBook Pro to an M4 MacBook Air. I'm comparing an M4 MacBook Air to a 2019 MacBook Pro. So obviously there's going to be big discrepancies, but I just wanted to see how much I would gain by moving to a MacBook Air for a little while and giving the kids my old MacBook Pro and see how that works out. So to compare these systems, I'm going to use 4 different benchmarks. We're going to use Cinebench 2024, Basemark GPU, Basemark Web, and I'm going to use Safari for both of the MacBooks, and then Sysbench. And then lastly, I'll do like a practical comparison on Baldur's Gate 3 and Valheim. On both systems, when I ran the tests, I only had a CPU monitor running and Obsidian notes open in the background for me to take notes on. And I understand that these tests are kind of arbitrary and it's not like super accurate to what, it's hard to translate a number on Cinebench over to, real world performance, but you have to start somewhere, so here we are. Now let's start with Cinebench. I really wanted to stress test how quickly the thermal throttling kicked in on the MacBook Air. So with all of these tests, I ran them back to back to back, straight from the multi-core to the single core and over to the GPU tests. And right out of the gate, the M4 MacBook Air blew the 2019 MacBook Pro out of the water. In the first test, the M4 Air blew the Intel Pro out of the water with a score of 709 compared to 392. But by the second test, the thermal throttling made a huge difference, and the Air lost about 30% of its performance, scoring only 517. It still beat the MacBook Pro, which, thanks to its fans, scored essentially the same at 389. Now, without letting the MacBook Air cool down at all, we went right into the single core tests, where in both the first and the second test, the M4 Air nearly tripled the Intel MacBook Pro's score. And last, again, without letting it cool down, I put the MacBook Air right into a GPU test. The MacBook Pro doesn't meet the hardware requirements for Cinebench's GPU test, so these results here are just on the Air, and we'll compare it to the Air after modification. With Basemark GPU, the story was essentially the same, with the M4 Air beating the MacBook Pro, but losing points subsequently on each run as the throttling kicked in. Basemark Web and Cinebench don't push the systems in the same way that Basemark GPU and Cinebench do, but the story was essentially the same on both of these tests, with the M4 Air nearly doubling or tripling the scores that the Intel MacBook was getting. Now on to gaming. I game for fun, not for FPS. Gaming for me is about hanging out with friends, winding down at the end of the day, and I don't need to have 120 FPS to have a good time. But I'll be honest, these days I really don't game a lot because of the poor experience that I have on my MacBook Pro. and I really don't game enough to justify purchasing a whole new system for it. So, I mean, you see here in the back, generally, if I game, it's just on the Nintendo Switch. But there are some games that don't play great on the Switch either that I'd like to play. One of those is Baldur's Gate 3 and Valheim. With the default settings on Baldur's Gate 3, I average 12 to 25 FPS. Now for a top-down, turn-based RPG, it sucks, but honestly, it isn't the end of the world. But yeah, it sucks. Valheim, on the other hand, is much harder to stomach. On my Intel MacBook, FPSs hover around 20 to 30, but I start getting stutters in the middle of gameplay. And the game will lag behind my mouse movements by quite a bit. It's really just not fun. Now, I was genuinely surprised on how well the M4 Air did right out of the box with Baldur's Gate 3. Using default settings, the game was snappy and held a steady frame rate, around or above 30 FPS, and all this while essentially only using the efficiency cores. Once the CPU heated up, the Air quickly turned off the performance cores altogether. So we weren't even using the performance cores. And the Air impressed me just as much with Valheim, holding frame rates near 40 FPS. Snappy movements and stutters had disappeared, and the gameplay was honestly great by my standards. However, as with Baldur's Gate, once you get into the game, the performance cores are quickly turned off, leaving the gameplay essentially only running on those efficiency cores. Now, I know a lot of people are going to have a lot higher standards for gaming. Like I said, for me, it's just about getting on there and having fun. Okay, so now we get to the fun part, which is seeing if we can modify this M4 MacBook Air to give us MacBook Pro performance. So in this computer, up here is the logic board of the laptop, and then down here is essentially your battery. There's a gap between this back panel and that logic board. There's an air gap. So that air gap means that that heat kind of dissipates throughout the whole laptop and not out the back. And that's because when you set it on your lap, if it was to just heat up, it would be extremely uncomfortable. But 99% of the time when I use my laptop, I'm sitting at this desk with my laptop over in the corner. So it's not a big deal to me. So the plan is we're going to remove this back panel. We're going to put some thermal pads on here to bridge that gap and let that heat escape out through the back panel of the laptop. And we're going to see how much that improves our performance having this area to dissipate all that heat through. It's not going to happen in this video, but in another video, I plan on building a stand that goes here on my desk that will extract even more heat out of that. Stand by for another video. But for now, let's dig into this and see what we can see. Okay, so here is our MacBook Air. And I gotta grab my glasses. I'm getting old. Woo! You know, one thing I find really funny is that a lot of other tech creators own the Linus Tech Tips screwdriver. And I will notice other creators say lttstore.com. I do not have the Linus screwdriver. I have the Klein Tools Home Depot one that was like 15 bucks. So homedepot.com. Do I have the right bit? You can tell I did a lot of research for this video. I don't even have the right screwdriver. Let's see. Shoot, dude. Subscribe for more Find Your Bit content. All right, we're gonna look it up online. P5? P5. Well, turns out I don't have the right one. This sucks. Back in a moment. Oh yeah, my fourth favorite store. Yep, let's get it. Let's go. Walmart.com. Can you hear this thing bubbling? LaCroix.com. Okay, I got the right one. Let's do this. That is the one. Okay, there's our back plate. Okay, so real quick, on the back of the computer here, up here is the logic board, under like right here. And you got the battery right here, and your trackpad. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna use this. Okay, so right here we have a thermal pad. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna stick this thermal pad right here over the CPU. The CPU and GPU is right underneath, like right here. So that's where we're gonna put this, and there's this ribbon cable for the trackpad, and I'm just gonna stick this thermal pad right on top of it. So let's get to it. So for these thermal pads, I ended up placing a 1.5 millimeter thermal pad right over the CPU and GPU, and then another 1 millimeter thermal pad over the other components, and it turned out pretty good. Okay, I don't even have the screws yet in, and I don't know if you can like see, but I mean, I don't notice a bulge on there. So this side is just a little bit flexed up, but I don't have a screw on it yet. You can definitely tell, you know, there's a little more flex on this side than over here where we have the thermal pads, but that's what we want. So let's go ahead and tighten it back down. Okay, so I finally figured out my screwdriver trouble, and I was able to get the thermal pads in place between the CPU and the back plate of the laptop. And after I got that in place, I booted up the Mac and ran it through the same set of benchmarks that I had done before. And I will be honest, I was blown away by the performance that I got with that one simple change. In Cinebench, on the multi-core test, right off the bat, on the very first test, I saw an 11% increase in performance. And in the second test, once things were heated up, I saw a 48% increase in performance compared to the Air's second multi-core test before and after. The single core results weren't quite as dramatic, but we still saw a 2 and 12% increases over the corresponding runs before and after the mod. And for the Cinebench GPU test, we saw 20 and 16% increase in performance compared to before and after the thermal pads. Basemark GPU had similar results, with the modded M4 Air beating its previous runs once it had gotten up to temperature by up to 22%. And Basemark Web likewise saw a 21% increase in performance with the thermal pads. So going off of just these benchmark tests, with $15 worth of thermal pads, about 10 minutes worth of your time once you have the right screwdrivers, you're able to boost the performance of your MacBook Air by roughly 20%. And all of that without the noise of the fans that you get in a MacBook Pro. Now, on to gaming. To be honest, I didn't notice a huge difference compared to before and after the thermal pads. Baldur's Gate 3 ran fine, and I saw frame rates in the low 30s, which was about the same as before. The story is about the same with Valheim. I have no complaints. I had steady frame rates in the low 30s and no hiccups or stutters. The story gets a bit more interesting, however, when we look at the performance graphs with the mod in place. So before, the performance cores simply turned off when you were in a game and left the efficiency cores to do all the work. However, now with both the games, we see that the performance cores are getting some playtime. And in this graph, I'm not 100% sure what to make of it, because it looks kind of spiky, like there are times when maybe the performance and efficiency cores are swapping over as that temperature's kind of maybe just in like a threshold zone where they're swapping back and forth. So I think with maybe just a tiny bit more passive cooling even on the MacBook Air, we might be able to see that stable out to where the performance cores are getting to really shine. And again, like I said earlier, my standards for gaming are really low. I just game to have fun. I don't care about the frame rates that much. And honestly, this is a night and day difference compared to my MacBook Pro, and I'm happy with it. Okay, now let's address what some of you are probably thinking is the elephant in the room. Now that we have those thermal pads in place, all of that heat is getting let out the bottom of the case. So how hot is the bottom of the laptop? Now, for regular use cases, using word processing, some light programming, I don't notice the case top or bottom get warm at all. It just stays perfectly cool. However, when the laptop is under load, the bottom plate gets uncomfortably hot. Okay, so it's in the middle of a Cinebench test. Yeah, that's toasty. Let's get closer to the CPU there. Dang, that's way hot. Now, personally, I really don't see this as a huge issue. First reason why is because 99% of the time, my laptop sits right there on my desk. So even when I do something that's gonna stress the CPU, it's sitting over there on my desk, it's not gonna burn my legs. Second, anytime I do have my laptop out and about, I'm sitting on the couch watching a movie or I'm browsing the web next to my wife. I'm really not doing anything that's gonna push the laptop. And if I'm out and about gaming with friends or my brothers or whatever, I'm sitting at a table and the laptop's on a table, it's not on my lap. And in my opinion, I actually think there's a benefit to all that heat being let out the bottom of the chassis. I ran a benchmark to get a thermal reading on the bottom of the laptop. So I started the benchmark and I kind of got distracted doing some other things, and I was waiting for the computer to heat up because before the keyboard would get kind of warm once it got to temperature. I totally forgot about it because all that heat was going out the bottom. My hands didn't feel it at all. So unless you do all of your gaming with your laptop sitting in your lap, I really don't see this as a big issue. I think there might be issues with that backplate heating up the batteries, but for how often I have my laptop under a real load, I think it's not an issue. And down the road, I plan on putting some passive cooling in place to minimize that even more. So if you're someone that has a MacBook Air and $15 to spend on thermal pads and maybe another $15 to get the right screwdriver, I would totally recommend this mod for anyone. It was super accessible and super easy to do, and honestly, I'd recommend it to anyone. In summary, I'm sorry my kiddos, you guys will be getting the old MacBook Pro. And I'll be honest, there's a good chance that when the next MacBook Pros come out, with potentially an M5, I might just stick with the MacBook Air version and see if this mod works again in the next model. As someone who travels a fair bit and who takes my laptop with me everywhere and really doesn't probably fall under the pro user category, I think that the MacBook Air gives me everything I need, and with this little mod, I get nearly MacBook Pro performance out of a MacBook Air. So that's it for me. If you made it to this point in the video, thank you so much. You're amazing. I would love to hear any thoughts you have. You're welcome to drop those in the comments. And at some point, I plan on doing another video to see if I can build a passive cooler for this laptop for as cheap as possible. That helps me get a little bit more performance out of it and maybe prevent any long-term damage that could potentially happen from the backplate heating up the battery. So if you're interested, please subscribe at some point and you can get a notification when that happens. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video and have an amazing day. Thanks so much.